In the wake of the Ghomeshi story and trial and so much public attention, many of us in the violence against women prevention community just continue to be so frustrated with not only the experience of survivors who do come forward and are willing to engage with the criminal justice process, but looking specifically at elements of that process. And many of us, were either of the mind or had come to the conclusion that in many ways, some foundations of the criminal justice process, which we wouldn't challenge for their need and their importance, but they just seem to be a bad fit for this particular kind of criminal offense and for primarily the women survivors who seek it for some sort of redress. So as a result of that, we came up with the idea that we should bring our resources together to try to figure out if there is an alternative justice approach for survivors of gendered violence. And this has led to a project that we call Do Justice for All. What we're trying to do through this project is to seek an alternative to the criminal justice system in order to deal with gender-based violence in the sexual realm. And it's a collaborative approach that, first of all, has brought together three primary organizations that are leading the project, and I'll get to those three in the next slide. And then I do want to acknowledge that this particular project is, it's a 3-year project that has received funding from Status of Women Canada under a larger rubric of trying to encourage systemic change, and in this case led by and empowered by women. So as I said, it's collaborative from the very starting point, because we have developed it through a joint leadership approach. And the three organizations that are leading this are the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, LEAF. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. They are established in 1985 to improve equality for women. And their main strengths are in research and advocacy and obviously in litigation and public policy. And so they bring their strengths to this project. As Julie mentioned, METRAC, the organization that I come from, is also involved, and we are generally aimed at preventing gender-based violence through education and safety. My role there as legal director is to run a community justice project where we develop and we distribute legal information and legal education to assist women and service providers who work with women to understand their legal rights, to understand better the justice system, and to not always, and particularly not in the area of sexual violence, not always encourage that the legal system provides a good or the best option, but at least to give them more information about that option, about the pros and the cons, and to allow women to make an informed decision about how they want to proceed and whether or not they do want to avail themselves of what exists within the legal system now. That's a little bit more about METRAC. And then our third partner, and this is intended to be in alphabetical order, although I guess I was thinking LEAF with an L. Our third partner is Women at the Center. And if you're not familiar with this group, this is an organization that is established and is for survivors of gendered violence. Their mandate is to have an impact on policy and systemic change, and to enable the voices of women who are directly affected by violence and who self-identify as survivors to be part of that project and to help inform the work that has to be done to improve the situation. And so the three of us have come together for this project, the DJA, Do Justice for All. And so I'm trying to give a sense of why we think it's innovative. So I will discuss in more detail each of these bullets. But just to give you the overview, we think it's innovative because we are listening to survivors of sexual violence, and we are giving them a very a fundamental place to be part of the discussion and to have some influence on this alternative justice pathway. When I say that we are working collaboratively, it extends beyond just the 3 partners who lead the project. We are extending across sectors that are doing work related to gender-based violence in a variety of ways to get as much informed and creative feedback on how to actually come up with an alternate model. I'll tell you a little bit about the steering committee in a minute, but just to give you a sense that when I say across sectors, we're reaching into various organizations that work in the violence against women sector, rape crisis centers, settlement agencies, as well as the health sector, as well as the academic sector, and of course the legal sector, both criminal and civil, including human rights, administrative. Another way we think that this is innovative is that we're doing research into national and international approaches. So we are conducting a literature review, and we're looking at one of the things that I talk about in the community as the legal director at METRAC is we go into the community and we talk about other options within the existing legal system for people who've experienced gender-based violence and don't necessarily want to go to police or don't want to exclusively rely on the criminal justice process. So for example, we'll be looking at the strengths and weaknesses of the human rights process, the strengths and weaknesses of the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board, and of course of civil actions and how that can work and what the limitations are there. But we're not focusing only on the national, and what I mean, this is an Ontario-based project, but many of the things that exist in Ontario are also available across the country. But we're looking locally. We'll also be doing research outside of Canada to see what has been tried there. I should say that we'll also be, for example, turning our minds to the restorative justice process and to see how that already has been discussed in terms that how it may or may not help survivors of gender-based violence. We'll be also doing research that is more local and participatory. And then finally, what we think is innovative is we're not just trying to tinker with the criminal justice process. We are looking for a completely new model that is going to be beyond modifying the status quo, that we hope will bring the best elements of the variety of models that we read about and take into account the needs and the dreams, I suppose, of survivors who've actually gone through the process. I mean, a very fundamental question, just to give you a sense, is I think it's really important to ask survivors, is it important for you to feel that justice has been done in order to have your attacker spend time in jail? And of course, if the answer is no, then we can completely circumvent the criminal justice process and all of those built-in elements that can be a bad fit or in fact further traumatizing to survivors. So just adding a little bit more detail, I realize I'm probably getting to the end of my 10 minutes, but when we say that we're listening to survivors, we are incorporating them into very fundamental aspects of the work of this project. So the organization Women at the Center is leading a court watch project to actually go into sexual assault trials both at the Ontario Court of Justice and the Superior Court of Justice. They have a system by which they have volunteers who are trained, and then they document elements of what they see as a member of the public in the process. We have started to do that, or they have started to do that work on the project in Toronto, and we want to get outside of Toronto. We're thinking of going into Renfrew County, and of course that raises other challenges in terms of even the number of cases and how we get locally based volunteers to do work there. But that's one way of collecting information about what's not, or well, working and not working in the criminal justice process. They're also going to directly interview through surveys survivors for not specifically their experience, but for what didn't or did work for them when they went through the criminal justice process, and what are their ideas for a new model. So we're planning for surveys in person, possibly online, doing focus groups, trying to get out of the GTA again, and also including survivors in our steering committee so that they are really integrated through the project, I think, in a way that systemically they have not been included in the kinds of discussions that have happened to date. So I said we're working collaboratively in addition to the 3 partners on the project and having a provincial focus, and as I've mentioned, trying to get out into areas outside of Toronto to collect this information as well. We've pulled together a steering committee, as I said, from a broad range of perspectives, and trying also to include the voices of people who have a perspective that isn't that includes other areas of identification. So we have representatives from DAWN, the Disabled Women's Network. We are working with representatives from post-secondary education to include that perspective of younger women primarily who experience and are at risk of sexual violence. And we are working collaboratively with Indigenous women who are doing their own work in this area, but we're inviting them to consult where they feel it's appropriate. We've also constituted a research advisory committee to do the research led by LEAF, and that too is a fairly varied group of both academics and practitioners. As I mentioned, the focus is, in terms of research, both national and international, primary and secondary research being brought together. And this work is ultimately going to lead to a proposal for what I have been discussing as an alternative justice model. And with that working model, we, as I say, it's not going to be just a variation on the criminal justice system. We are going to take that model and consult with our larger steering committee and figure out how that we can actually run some sort of a pilot test of this new model. As a lawyer, I think a huge question is how will this model coexist with the criminal justice system, which of course is not going to go away. But as I said, we're going in with lots of questions and hoping to have at least some ideas for answers at the end of the 3 years. So our aim is to generate systemic change, which is the very long view, to improve the experience of gender-based, of survivors of gender-based violence if they do choose to engage with a legal process. And I guess that's a fitting place to end, to say that this is really our first more formal foray into a legal group, because you know, we have Crown attorneys, we have civil lawyers, we have sort of people involved in the VWAP and MAG. They're interested and involved already, but we want to talk to the criminal defense bar. We want to get the view of the judiciary, whether, you know, I know that's a sensitive area, but we'll figure out how to do it. So my invitation to you is, if you are interested in participating or know someone who might be interested in participating, I have some printed explanations of the project. My name is Tamara Whittleson. You can contact me at METRAC if you have some ideas. We'll be doing some more formal outreach through TAG as we progress through the project. And I'll just leave it at that and answer any questions if there are.